For most of human history, going to sleep may have been the most dangerous thing a person could do. Early humans did not simply lie down wherever night arrived. Some places stayed strangely quiet. Others carried hidden risks: a cold pocket of air, loose stone, the smell of predators, water that rose without warning. Long before beds or houses existed, people may have survived because they slowly learned a difficult skill: how to recognize a place where the night was less likely to kill them. But what made one resting place feel safe, while another never was? Imagine a night with no locked doors, no glass windows, and no soft certainty that the darkness outside would remain outside. For early humans, sleep was not simply a time to recover. It may have been one of the most vulnerable moments of the entire day. A person who slept deeply could not watch the horizon, listen carefully to nearby sounds, or react quickly to sudden movement. The body needed rest, yet rest itself carried risks. This uncomfortable balance shaped an important question that humans may have faced for thousands upon thousands of years. Where could someone lie down and still have a reasonable chance of waking up in the morning? Modern people often think of danger in dramatic ways, imagining enormous predators constantly waiting just beyond the firelight. The reality was probably quieter, though no less serious. For most prehistoric groups, many dangers came from ordinary things. A low place in the land might gather cold air during the night, making sleep far more difficult in harsh seasons. Ground that appeared dry before sunset could become wet after rain or changing temperatures. Insects, sharp stones, sudden wind, unstable slopes, or even the wrong choice of resting place near water could slowly turn a peaceful night into a dangerous one. Archaeologists and anthropologists are careful not to imagine prehistoric life as endless panic. Early humans were not helpless wanderers living in constant terror. They observed their surroundings carefully because they had to. Like many animals today, humans likely learned patterns in the land. Some places felt calmer, some remained dry after storms, some allowed better views of approaching movement. Others trapped cold air or made escape difficult. Over long periods of time, these small observations may have mattered far more than we sometimes realize. A comfortable resting place did not need to be perfect. It only needed to be safer than the alternatives nearby. This difference may sound small, but small differences often shaped survival in the prehistoric world. Even today, many animals show careful sleeping behavior. Deer often rest in places where they can quickly flee. Primates choose branches or areas with better visibility. Certain birds select locations that reduce exposure to predators or harsh weather. Humans, though different in many ways, were still living creatures shaped by the same nightly problem: how to become temporarily defenseless without paying too high a price. Long before houses existed, long before villages or fences, the landscape itself may have served as a kind of silent guide. A rocky overhang could block rain. A slightly elevated patch of land might stay drier than lower ground. A narrow entrance could make movement easier to notice during the night. These were not inventions in the modern sense. No one suddenly discovered a perfect answer. More likely, knowledge grew slowly through repetition, observation, and memory. Certain places may have been revisited because previous nights there had passed quietly. Others may have been avoided after signs of danger appeared too often. Sleep, in this way, became connected to learning. The night was not simply endured. It was studied, little by little, even if no one would have described it that way. Somewhere in this long process, humans may have begun to understand something deeply practical. Safety was rarely guaranteed, but sometimes it could be improved. And before anyone built walls, people may have first learned to trust the shape of the land itself. Night could change a familiar landscape into something strangely difficult to understand. A place that seemed calm in daylight might feel entirely different after sunset, when vision became limited and small sounds carried farther through the dark. For early humans, choosing where to rest was likely not a casual decision made at the end of exhaustion. The wrong place could bring discomfort at best and serious danger at worst. Yet the dangers of the night were often quieter than popular stories suggest. They were not always dramatic moments of survival against giant predators. Many risks were ordinary, repeated, and deeply practical. Cold may have been one of the greatest challenges. In many environments, temperatures drop sharply after sunset, especially in open areas or low valleys where cold air settles near the ground. Even today, hikers are taught that a small change in elevation can affect nighttime comfort. Early humans, without insulated clothing or permanent shelter, were likely sensitive observers of these changes. A slightly raised patch of land might feel warmer than the hollow below it. A rocky surface that absorbed sunlight during the day could remain warmer for a short time after sunset. These details sound small to modern ears, yet over many nights they may have become important lessons. Water created another difficult problem. Resting too close to rivers or lakes may have offered advantages during the day, including drinking water and easier access to animals or edible plants. But nighttime brought different concerns. Damp ground cools the body more quickly. Sudden rain could change the shape of nearby streams. In some regions, insects gather near standing water, making sleep unpleasant or even dangerous through bites and infection. Choosing distance mattered. Too far from water created its own problems, yet too close carried risks that may only become obvious after several difficult nights. Wind also shaped decisions in ways easy to overlook. A strong nighttime breeze can remove body warmth surprisingly quickly. A resting place protected by trees, stone, or natural curves in the land might have felt calmer and warmer. At the same time, complete enclosure carried different concerns. A place with poor visibility could limit awareness of approaching animals or unfamiliar movement. Safety may have involved compromise rather than perfection. Humans were likely searching not for ideal comfort, but for the least dangerous option available in that particular landscape. The question of predators is more difficult to discuss carefully because evidence remains incomplete. Large carnivores certainly existed alongside early humans in many regions, and some prehistoric sites suggest complicated relationships between people and animals sharing caves or territories. Yet scholars are cautious not to exaggerate constant attacks. Fear alone would not explain human behavior. Instead, repeated observation may have mattered more. Areas with animal tracks, strong smells, or signs of regular movement may have been treated differently. Places with wider views or fewer hiding spaces may have felt easier to trust. Over time, people likely noticed which places allowed quieter nights and which repeatedly brought disturbance. This growing awareness slowly connected survival to geography. Sleep was becoming less accidental. Even without maps or buildings, humans may have begun reading the land in practical ways. A slope could provide better visibility. A cluster of stones might block wind. Dry ground could matter more than soft ground. In this sense, rest itself became a skill, shaped not by comfort alone, but by careful choices repeated over generations. Somewhere in these quiet decisions, humans may have started learning a lesson that still feels familiar today. Not every place allows the body to truly relax, even when exhaustion demands sleep. At first, it may seem that early humans simply stopped wherever darkness arrived and slept until morning. Exhaustion can make almost any patch of ground feel acceptable for a short moment. Yet over long stretches of time, an important difference may have slowly become impossible to ignore. There is a difference between a place where someone can sleep and a place where someone is likely to sleep safely. This distinction may sound obvious to modern ears, but for prehistoric people, learning it was probably slow, practical, and shaped by repeated experience rather than sudden understanding. Imagine returning to the same kind of place after several difficult nights elsewhere. Perhaps an elevated ridge stayed drier after rain. Perhaps a rocky overhang reduced wind during colder evenings. Perhaps one area carried fewer signs of animals passing nearby after sunset. No one needed to invent a theory about safety for these patterns to matter. Human beings are naturally skilled at noticing repeated outcomes, especially when discomfort or danger follows bad decisions. Over many generations, early humans likely learned that some environments consistently offered calmer nights than others. Archaeologists cannot watch prehistoric evenings unfold. So much of this understanding comes from careful evidence and comparison. Certain sites show repeated human use across long periods of time, suggesting people return to places that worked well for temporary shelter or rest. This does not mean every chosen place was perfectly safe. Safety in prehistoric life was probably relative. A resting place did not eliminate danger, it merely reduced some risks compared to what surrounded it. That difference may have meant warmer sleep, better visibility, or fewer unpleasant surprises after dark. Even small improvements could matter when repeated night after night. The shape of the land itself may have quietly guided human behavior. High ground offered broader views, allowing people to notice movement more easily. Slight shelter from rock or vegetation could reduce wind exposure without fully trapping someone in a hidden space. Areas near resources mattered too, but not every useful daytime location remained useful after sunset. A place ideal for gathering water or food could become cold, wet, or difficult to defend once darkness arrived. Over time, people may have begun separating daytime usefulness from nighttime safety. The land was not simply used, it was interpreted. Patterns in nature likely became part of memory. Some places felt trustworthy because previous nights there had passed without serious trouble. Others may have gathered quiet warnings: unstable ground, strange sounds, flooding after rain, signs of animal movement, or poor escape routes. These experiences may not have been discussed in abstract ways, yet they were likely remembered. A child growing up within a group could observe where older people preferred to stop, where fires were placed later in history, or which locations were quietly avoided. Knowledge about safe rest may have spread long before formal teaching ever existed. In this way, the search for safe sleep slowly became something larger than survival alone. It encouraged observation, memory, patience, and perhaps even cooperation. A person choosing a resting place was not only reacting to the moment, they were participating in a long process of learning from the land itself. Night after night, season after season, humans may have slowly discovered something surprisingly important. The world rarely offered perfect safety, but certain places asked less from the body and demanded fewer risks. And somewhere between caution and exhaustion, the earliest habits of choosing where to rest may have quietly begun to shape the future of human life. Before an early human could rest, there was likely another task that mattered almost as much as finding food or water. They had to decide where the night would happen. This decision may not have felt dramatic in the moment. It may have unfolded quietly through habit and observation long before sunset fully arrived. Somewhere during the late afternoon, people moving through a landscape may have begun noticing details that looked ordinary at first glance, but slowly revealed patterns over time. A slope that held warmth slightly longer, a place where the wind weakened, ground that remained dry even after changing weather. Over many generations, choosing where to sleep may have become one of the quiet skills that helped humans endure difficult environments. Reading the land did not require maps, measurements, or permanent markers. It depended on paying attention. A modern traveler might check weather forecasts or satellite images before camping. Early humans had only the landscape itself, yet landscapes often contain clues for those who spend enough time watching them. One of the first things people may have noticed was elevation. Low ground can seem comfortable during daylight because it often provides shelter from strong winds. But after sunset, cold air naturally sinks into valleys and depressions. Even today, campers sometimes wake to colder temperatures at the bottom of a slope than they expected. Early humans likely learned this lesson through experience rather than explanation. A slightly raised area may have brought colder wind during the day, yet offered more comfortable conditions overnight. The difference may not have seemed important at first, but repeated nights would slowly reveal what worked. Visibility likely mattered as well. A resting place with a wider view of the surrounding land could allow people to notice movement more easily. This does not mean humans stood guard in constant fear every evening. Instead, awareness may have offered quiet reassurance. Open views reduce surprises. A narrow path leading toward camp might reveal approaching animals sooner. A nearby hill could help someone understand where water flowed after rain. The land itself sometimes provided information if people remained observant enough to notice it, yet visibility alone could not solve everything. Exposure brought risks of its own. Completely open ground leaves little protection from weather, especially strong wind or sudden temperature changes. A place partly sheltered by rock, trees, or uneven terrain may have offered a better balance. Humans were probably not searching for perfect conditions because perfection rarely existed. Instead, they may have looked for compromise. Enough shelter to reduce discomfort, enough openness to remain aware of nearby movement. This careful balance between protection and awareness may have shaped countless nights long before permanent homes appeared. Signs left by animals may also have influenced decisions, though scholars remain cautious about overstating certainty. Tracks, droppings, smells, or repeated movement paths could quietly suggest whether an area was frequently used by large animals. Even without formal knowledge, repeated exposure teaches patterns. Many animals today avoid sleeping in heavily traveled spaces. Humans may have developed similar habits simply because certain places repeatedly felt calmer than others. Over time, observation likely turned into expectation. Some areas became familiar, some felt easier to trust. Reading the land may also have included smaller details easy to miss today. Loose stones on a slope could become dangerous in darkness. Wet soil might turn cold after sunset. Thick vegetation could hide insects or limit movement if someone needed to leave quickly. None of these details alone guaranteed safety. But together, they may have helped answer a difficult nightly question. If rest must happen somewhere, where is the place least likely to cause trouble? Long before walls, roofs, or villages changed human life, people may have begun shaping safety from nothing more than careful attention to the world around them. Choosing a place to rest may have involved more than simply looking at the shape of the land. For early humans, the environment itself was constantly offering small signals, though understanding them likely took time. No voice explained what to avoid. No written instructions warned of hidden danger. Knowledge may have arrived quietly, through nights that passed peacefully and nights that became unexpectedly uncomfortable. Gradually, people may have begun noticing that certain natural signs appeared before difficult evenings, while other signs often arrived before calmer ones. Wind was likely one of the first things to matter. Even without modern understanding of weather, repeated experience teaches patterns. A steady breeze moving through a valley could feel harmless during daylight, yet become deeply uncomfortable after dark when temperatures dropped. At the same time, completely still air was not always ideal either. In some landscapes, stillness near damp ground could mean colder temperatures or heavier moisture settling overnight. A place partly protected from strong wind, but not completely trapped by it, may have offered better rest. Humans likely learned these details slowly, simply by living through enough nights to notice differences. Sound may have mattered too, though perhaps not in the dramatic way people imagine. Darkness changes how sound behaves. Without daylight distractions, distant movement becomes easier to notice. Water moving over stone, insects in thick vegetation, branches shifting in wind, or the footsteps of nearby animals all create different patterns. Early humans probably became highly familiar with ordinary nighttime sounds because unfamiliar sounds often stand out most clearly against a background of repetition. A place where the night sounded strangely active may have felt different from one where familiar rhythms repeated calmly. This would not require constant fear, only attention. Humans, like many animals, naturally learn what feels ordinary in a given environment. Smell may have quietly shaped decisions as well. Though modern humans often rely heavily on sight, scent still provides important information. Damp soil smells different before rain. Animal presence sometimes leaves traces, difficult to describe but easy to notice over time. Certain locations may have carried the smell of standing water, decay, or repeated animal movement. No single scent guaranteed danger, yet together they may have helped shape impressions of whether a place felt trustworthy enough for sleep. Sometimes, the safest choice may have come down to avoiding discomfort rather than escaping immediate risk. Sleep becomes difficult when the body stays cold, wet, or restless. A place that repeatedly interrupted rest would eventually lose value, even if it caused no serious harm. Over long periods of time, humans likely discovered that good rest itself had survival value. A tired person notices less, moves slower, and reacts poorly during the next day's challenges. Finding places where sleep came more easily may have mattered more than we sometimes assume. Light may also have influenced decisions in subtle ways. Before artificial lighting existed, the final hours before darkness likely carried practical importance. Watching where shadows gathered, noticing where morning sunlight arrived first, or understanding how hills blocked cold evening air may have slowly shaped behavior. Some places remained warm slightly longer, others turned dark and cold much earlier than expected. These differences were quiet, but repeated enough times, quiet details become memory. In this way, choosing where to rest may have slowly transformed into something resembling environmental knowledge, not scientific knowledge in the modern sense, but careful familiarity built through observation. The land, the weather, the sounds, and even the feeling of air itself may have begun teaching early humans where the night felt less demanding. A resting place did not need to promise safety. It only needed to increase the odds that morning would arrive without too much trouble. And somewhere in those countless evenings, humans may have learned that survival sometimes depends on noticing the smallest things before darkness arrives. For early humans, safety may have depended on decisions so small they would barely seem important at first glance. A few steps higher, up a slope, a place just beyond damp ground, a sleeping spot closer to stone than open grass. Modern life often hides how powerful tiny environmental choices can be, because walls, heating, and stable shelter reduce many everyday risks. But for people living closely with the landscape, even small details may have quietly shaped the difference between an uncomfortable night and a dangerous one. Imagine two resting places separated by only a short distance. One lies in a shallow dip where cool air settles after sunset. The other sits slightly above, more exposed to breeze during the day but drier and less cold at night. During daylight, both places might appear equally useful. Yet after several evenings, patterns would likely emerge. One location may repeatedly leave the body colder and less rested. The other may simply feel easier to sleep in. No dramatic lesson would be necessary. Over time, repeated experience becomes memory, and memory begins shaping habit. This kind of learning likely happened again and again across generations. Ground texture may have mattered more than people sometimes imagine. Rocky terrain sounds uncomfortable to modern ears, yet firm ground can remain drier than softer earth after rainfall. Slightly raised stone surfaces might reduce moisture while also improving visibility. At the same time, unstable rocks or steep slopes created problems of their own. Early humans were probably not searching for comfort in a modern sense. They were likely weighing trade-offs without needing to describe them aloud. A place slightly harder to lie on may still be preferred if it reduced cold or standing water. The shape of nearby vegetation could influence decisions too. Dense plant cover might block wind and offer some protection from weather, but it could also reduce visibility or make movement more difficult in darkness. Thick vegetation can hide insects, snakes in certain regions, or narrow escape routes if disturbed. On the other hand, completely open areas exposed people to changing weather and left little natural protection. Again, the most useful place may not have been the most comfortable or the most hidden. It may have been the place that balanced several needs at once. Even something as simple as orientation may have slowly mattered. Certain resting areas may have received morning sunlight earlier, helping warmth return after cold nights. Others remained shaded longer, holding moisture and cooler temperatures. Humans may not have spoken about this in abstract ways, yet practical experience often teaches quietly. People remember what repeatedly feels easier, warmer, or calmer. Through repetition, small advantages begin shaping preference. Over many thousands of years, these ordinary choices may have created an invisible map of trusted spaces. Some locations likely became familiar stopping points because they repeatedly worked. Others were avoided not because of a single terrible event, but because they simply demanded too much from the body, too much wind, too much dampness, too much uncertainty. In this way, humans may have slowly learned that safe rest rarely comes from one perfect feature. It often comes from many small improvements gathered together, slightly warmer, slightly drier. Slightly easier to watch, slightly quieter. The land did not provide certainty, but sometimes it offered better odds. And perhaps this gradual understanding explains something important about the earliest human search for safety. People may not have discovered perfect places to sleep. They may have simply become remarkably skilled at noticing which places caused fewer problems than the others nearby. As this quiet knowledge grew, another question slowly emerged. Once humans began recognizing safer patterns in the land, where did they actually choose to settle for the night? Did safety come from open ground, from trees, or from the shelter of stone itself? When people imagine early humans resting at night, the image often appears simple, a fire glowing deep inside a cave, while people sleep safely behind stone walls. It is a familiar picture, but reality was likely more complicated. Archaeologists have found evidence that some prehistoric humans used caves and rock shelters at different times, yet caves were never the only answer, and they were not automatically safe. In fact, much of early human history may have involved sleeping in a wide variety of temporary places, depending on climate, season, available resources, and the shape of the surrounding land. Long before houses existed, humans likely learned to make use of whatever natural protection the environment offered. Rock shelters may have been among the most useful options in certain regions. Unlike deep caves, a rock overhang could provide partial cover without fully surrounding people in darkness. A stone ledge above might reduce rain exposure, soften strong wind, and offer a more stable resting place than completely open ground. In colder environments, blocking even part of the wind could make an important difference overnight. Yet these places also carried limitations. Water runoff after storms could make some shelters unexpectedly wet. Loose stone could become dangerous. Narrow spaces reduced visibility and limited movement. The most protected place was not always the safest one. Caves present an especially interesting question because popular imagination often treats them as permanent prehistoric homes. Evidence suggests the truth was probably less consistent. Some caves show repeated signs of human activity over long periods, including hearths, tools, and food remains. Yet many caves also appear to have been shared spaces, visited by both humans and animals at different times. Carnivores sometimes occupied caves as dens. Seasonal changes may have altered whether a location remained practical. In some cases, people likely stayed near cave entrances rather than deep inside, where smoke, darkness, poor airflow, or dampness created challenges of their own. A cave could reduce some risks while increasing others. The search for safe rest was rarely simple. In environments without rock shelter, trees may have offered different forms of protection. Anthropologists studying more recent hunter-gatherer societies note that people often make careful use of shade, natural windbreaks, and vegetation patterns. Large trees can soften wind, reduce exposure to rain, and provide familiar landmarks within changing landscapes. Though evidence from very early periods remains limited, it is reasonable to think humans often used natural cover creatively rather than depending on a single type of shelter. A cluster of bushes, fallen branches, or the protected side of uneven ground may sometimes have been enough for one night's rest. The goal was likely not permanence, it was practicality. Geography mattered deeply. Open grasslands, forests, coastal regions, mountains, and colder climates all offered different possibilities. A place that worked well in one environment might fail completely in another. Humans moving across varied landscapes had to remain flexible. This flexibility may have become one of the species' quiet strengths. Rather than mastering one perfect shelter, people learned to recognize useful patterns wherever they traveled. A rock face in one region, a sheltered grove in another, slight elevation near water somewhere else. Safety came not from repeating the same answer, but from adapting old lessons to new places. Over time, this practical knowledge likely became part of daily life. Choosing where to sleep was not separate from survival. It was survival. And perhaps this explains something important about early humans. Before building anything permanent, they may have first learned how to borrow protection from the land itself, using stone, trees, and natural cover, not as perfect homes, but as temporary partners against the uncertainty of the night. A cave may seem like the obvious answer to the problem of safe sleep. Thick stone walls, shelter from wind, and protection from rain can make caves appear almost perfect from a modern perspective. Yet for early humans, choosing a cave may have required caution rather than excitement. Not every cave welcomed rest, and some may have carried risks hidden from daylight. Over time, people likely learned that stone shelter alone was not enough. A place could feel protected, while quietly creating new problems once darkness arrived. One of the first concerns may have been moisture. Deep spaces often hold cooler temperatures and damp air, especially in regions where sunlight struggles to reach far inside. A dry place to lie down matters more than it first appears. Dampness slowly steals body warmth, turning sleep into something restless and exhausting. A cave entrance protected from rain but still touched by moving air may sometimes have been more useful than the deeper interior. In colder climates especially, remaining dry may have mattered almost as much as remaining sheltered. Airflow likely shaped decisions too. Modern visitors sometimes imagine prehistoric humans living comfortably in the deepest parts of caves, yet smoke, stale air, darkness, and colder temperatures could make these spaces unpleasant. Later evidence of fire use suggests that ventilation mattered whenever smoke became part of human life. Even before controlled fire became common, people may have preferred places where air moved gently rather than spaces that felt trapped or difficult to leave. A shelter that blocks danger while trapping discomfort may eventually stop feeling safe. Visibility presented another difficult balance. A narrow entrance offers protection in some ways because movement becomes easier to notice. Yet a place with only one difficult exit could also create problems if sudden danger arrived. The safest resting place may not always have been the most enclosed one. A partially sheltered overhang, open enough to observe the surroundings but protected enough to reduce weather exposure, may sometimes have offered a better compromise. Humans likely learned these differences gradually, through repeated nights rather than perfect planning. Animal activity made cave choices even more complicated. Archaeological evidence shows that some caves were occupied by large carnivores at different points in prehistory. Humans and animals sometimes used the same locations at different times, meaning caves could shift from useful shelter to risky territory depending on season, food availability, or recent activity. Signs of repeated animal presence, smells, tracks, bones, droppings, or disturbed ground may have influenced whether a place felt trustworthy. Again, the process was probably practical rather than dramatic. People did not need complete certainty. They only needed enough information to improve their chances. Even rock shelters that seemed promising could behave differently after storms or seasonal changes. Water may suddenly flow through familiar resting places after heavy rain. Loose rock may shift unexpectedly. Wind direction changes could make one side of a shelter colder than before. In this way, safe rest was never permanently solved. It required constant adjustment. The land kept changing, and humans had to change with it. Perhaps this explains why flexibility appears so important in human survival. Rather than depending on one perfect solution, people likely learned to compare options. One cave may work well in colder weather, but poorly during rain. One sheltered slope may feel safe for several nights before conditions shift. The question was rarely, is this place completely safe? It was more likely, is this place safer than what surrounds it right now? Somewhere in these careful choices, humans may have started understanding something deeply practical. A good resting place was not defined by how impressive it looked, but by how quietly it allowed the night to pass. Not every landscape offered caves or broad rock shelters, and even when they existed, humans could not always depend on them. This may explain why early people appear to have become remarkably flexible in the ways they approached rest. Instead of waiting for perfect shelter, they likely learned how to improve imperfect places. A sleeping place did not need to feel permanent. It only needed to feel manageable for one night, or perhaps a few nights, before movement continued again. Over thousands of years, this practical way of thinking may have shaped how humans interacted with nearly every environment they entered. In forested regions, large trees may have played an important role. A dense canopy can soften rain, reduce wind, and slightly change temperatures beneath it. Even today, standing beneath thick tree cover during poor weather often feels different from standing in open ground. Early humans likely noticed these differences quickly. A group stopping near strong tree cover may gain shelter without needing to travel farther in fading daylight. Yet trees brought trade-offs as well. Dense vegetation limits, visibility, and darkness beneath heavy cover can arrive earlier than in open land. Falling branches, insects, or damp soil may have complicated what first seemed like a comfortable choice. Again, the answer was rarely obvious. Safety required compromise. Uneven ground sometimes offered surprising advantages. A hillside, for example, could shield part of a resting area from strong wind, depending on direction. Natural ridges may have created quieter pockets of air, while still allowing wider views of nearby surroundings. Large fallen stones, shallow depressions, or even thick clusters of vegetation could function as temporary barriers against weather. Humans may not have seen these features as shelter in the modern sense, yet they could still shape whether sleep felt possible. Sometimes protection likely came from combining small advantages rather than finding one perfect location. Near coastlines or open plains, choices may have looked different. Strong winds, shifting temperatures, or limited natural cover forced people to adapt. A slightly raised place above wet ground may become more important than overhead shelter. A place protected from flooding after rain could matter more than comfort. In colder environments, reducing exposure to freezing air may outweigh visibility. Each landscape quietly changed the rules. Humans survived not because the world offered one reliable answer, but because they learned to ask better questions of the land itself. Where does water move after rain? Which side of the hill stays warmer? Where does wind feel weaker? Which place feels calm after dark? Archaeologists sometimes find traces of repeated human use in outdoor spaces without caves, reminding us that prehistoric life happened in many environments, not only dramatic stone shelters. Hearth remains, tools, or food debris suggest that people often return to locations that repeatedly served their needs. These were not permanent homes in the modern sense, but perhaps trusted stopping places, familiar enough to remember, reliable enough to revisit. The idea of safe may have slowly expanded through repetition. One useful night becomes several, several become habit, habit becomes knowledge shared across generations. In this way, early humans may have started shaping the landscape in their minds long before shaping it physically. Certain places likely became known for quieter nights, drier ground, or easier mornings. Other places quietly earned distrust. Perhaps the most important lesson was not where to sleep, but how to evaluate where to sleep. That skill could travel anywhere. A person moving into unfamiliar land could still look for sheltering stone, dry ground, protection from wind, and signs of disturbance. The environment changed, but the questions remained surprisingly familiar. And as humans slowly became better at recognizing patterns in safe rest, another quiet realization may have emerged. Some places did not simply feel safer for one evening. Some places seemed to stay trustworthy over time. Some places may have earned trust slowly, not because they looked impressive, but because the night passed there with fewer problems. A group might stop near a familiar rocky slope and wake dry after heavy rain. Another place may repeatedly leave everyone colder than expected. Somewhere else, strange sounds or signs of animal movement may disturb sleep too often to ignore. Over time, these experiences likely gathered into something quiet but powerful: memory. For early humans, learning where to rest safely may not have depended on sudden discoveries. It may have grown through repetition, through noticing what happened again and again in the same kinds of places. Humans are unusually skilled at remembering patterns. Even without formal language for explanation, people quickly learn which actions lead to comfort and which lead to trouble. A person who repeatedly wakes cold in low ground may begin avoiding it. A group that finds dry shelter near certain rock formations may return there whenever possible. These decisions do not require scientific knowledge. They only require experience repeated often enough to become habit. And habit, over long stretches of time, can quietly shape survival. This kind of learning likely became especially important because the natural world rarely behaved in completely predictable ways. A place that felt safe one season might change after heavy rainfall. Animal activity shifts over time. Wind direction changes. Water moves differently across the land depending on temperature and weather. No resting place stayed permanently perfect. Instead, people may have slowly learned something more useful: how to recognize places that usually caused fewer problems. Safety was rarely absolute. It was often statistical in the simplest sense. One place simply worked more often than another. A peaceful night leaves an impression, especially when difficult nights remain easy to remember. Some researchers believe memory and social learning played important roles in early human survival, and safe resting places may have been part of that process. Within small groups, younger members likely observed choices made by older individuals, where people paused before sunset, which places seemed to be avoided without much discussion. Which side of a slope people preferred. Knowledge does not always need formal teaching. Much of human learning happens through watching and repeating. A child seeing adults settle in certain areas again and again may gradually understand that some places feel different, even if no one explains exactly why. Small details likely accumulated meaning over time. A location where rainwater rarely gathered, ground that remained firm after weather changes, a resting spot with fewer signs of disturbance. Even sound may have mattered. Places where nights passed with familiar rhythms may slowly feel easier to trust than places filled with uncertainty. Humans are deeply sensitive to patterns, especially during moments of vulnerability, and sleep leaves people vulnerable in ways difficult to ignore. This slow building of trust may explain why certain locations were revisited across long periods in archaeological evidence. Not because people believed those places were magical or permanently safe, but because experience suggested they worked reasonably well. Familiarity itself can reduce uncertainty. A known place allows people to predict where cold gathers, where shelter improves, or how the surrounding environment behaves after sunset. Trust, in this way, may have emerged not from certainty, but from repeated calm. Yet memory worked in both directions. Just as peaceful places gained trust, difficult places may have quietly earned avoidance. A flooded hollow, a shelter too damp after rain, a slope that left the body exposed to cold wind. Sometimes survival may have depended less on finding perfect shelter and more on remembering what had gone wrong before. And perhaps somewhere in these repeated experiences, humans slowly began noticing something subtle but important. Some places did not simply feel safer because of shelter alone. They felt safer because the signs around them remained quietly predictable night after night. For early humans, the safest nights may not have come from luck alone. Over time, people likely learned to pay attention to small warnings hidden in ordinary details of the landscape. A place might appear calm at first glance, yet closer observation could quietly suggest caution. A strange smell lingering in still air, fresh tracks pressed into damp soil, unusual silence where familiar sounds were expected. None of these signs guaranteed danger, but together they may have helped people decide whether a place felt trustworthy enough to rest in until morning. Tracks were likely among the clearest clues available. Even today, experienced hunters, trackers, and wildlife observers can gather surprising information from marks left on the ground. Early humans, living much closer to natural rhythms than modern people, may have become highly skilled at noticing repeated patterns in animal movement. A narrow path worn into vegetation could suggest frequent travel. Large tracks near water might indicate repeated animal activity. Fresh disturbance in mud or soft earth may quietly signal that another creature had passed through not long before. This does not mean humans avoided every sign of animal life. Animals often lived near useful resources, but certain places may have felt less comfortable if movement seemed too regular or too close to resting areas. Smell may have acted as another quiet signal. Humans today often underestimate how much information scent can provide, perhaps because modern life hides many natural smells beneath buildings, roads, and enclosed spaces. Yet in open environments, scent changes constantly. Dampness before rain, decay near standing water, or traces left behind by animals can shape how a place feels long before the eyes fully understand why. A location carrying strong, unfamiliar smells may have felt different, even if no immediate threat appeared. Repeated experience likely taught people which scents often preceded unpleasant nights and which rarely caused concern. Sound may have been equally important, though not always in obvious ways. Nighttime environments often follow patterns. Insects begin their rhythms. Wind moves predictably through trees or grass. Water repeats familiar sounds against stone. Humans who regularly slept outdoors likely became deeply familiar with these ordinary backgrounds. Sometimes, what stood out most was not noise itself, but change. Sudden silence can feel strangely unsettling in nature. Unexpected movement nearby, repeated rustling, or sounds arriving from unusual directions may have quietly influenced decisions about whether to stay or move. None of this required fear, only attention. Even the shape of the land could offer warning signs if someone knew what to notice. Loose rocks near steep slopes might shift unexpectedly after dark. Narrow spaces may feel difficult to leave quickly. Ground marked by erosion could suggest water movement after storms. Areas too close to dense vegetation may limit visibility. The environment rarely announces danger directly. Instead, it offers hints, sometimes small enough to overlook unless someone has learned from previous mistakes. Over many generations, humans likely became better at recognizing these subtle signals. A safe resting place may not have been chosen because everything looked perfect, but because fewer warning signs appeared. Perhaps the air felt calmer, the ground seemed drier. Familiar nighttime sounds returned, as expected. The land felt easier to understand. In this way, trust may have slowly emerged from observation rather than certainty. Humans could never fully control the night, but they may have become remarkably skilled at reading clues before darkness arrived. Somewhere in that quiet habit of paying attention, survival became tied not only to strength or tools, but to noticing small changes that others might miss. And, as certain warning signs became easier to recognize, another pattern likely emerged as well. Some places simply seemed quieter than others, even when no obvious reason explained why. Some places may have earned a quiet reputation without anyone ever speaking of them in formal ways. A rocky slope where rain rarely caused trouble, a sheltered rise where the wind softened at night, a familiar patch of ground where sleep came more easily, and mornings arrived without unpleasant surprises. Over time, early humans may have begun returning to certain places, not because they guaranteed safety, but because they repeatedly felt less difficult than the alternatives. Trust, in this sense, may have grown slowly from repetition. One peaceful night can feel fortunate. Several peaceful nights in similar places begin to feel meaningful. Humans are naturally skilled at recognizing patterns, especially when survival quietly depends on them. A location that repeatedly offered dry ground, predictable sounds, and fewer disturbances may gradually become easier to trust. No place was ever completely free of risk, yet repeated calm likely mattered. Familiarity reduces uncertainty, and uncertainty becomes especially noticeable when darkness arrives. Even today, unfamiliar sleeping environments often feel harder to settle into, despite walls and locked doors. Perhaps this tendency reaches farther into human history than we usually imagine. Quietness itself may have carried meaning, not silence, because complete silence in nature is rare, but predictable quiet, the familiar sound of wind moving through trees, water repeating steady rhythms nearby, insects continuing their patterns through the evening. Humans who slept outdoors regularly likely became deeply familiar with these ordinary sounds. Over time, certain places may have developed a kind of environmental rhythm that felt easier to understand. A night filled with familiar patterns may have allowed deeper rest than one filled with uncertainty. The body relaxes differently when the surroundings seem predictable. Predictability may have mattered as much as shelter itself. This growing trust likely shaped movement across the landscape. Rather than choosing entirely new places each night, people may have revisited areas that worked reasonably well whenever conditions allowed. Archaeological evidence from some prehistoric sites suggests repeated occupation over long periods, though not always permanent settlement. A place offering practical advantages, dryness, visibility, nearby resources, or shelter might become a trusted stopping point during seasonal movement. Humans did not need to build walls before beginning to form attachments to place. Familiarity itself can become a form of comfort. Yet trust was probably flexible, not blind. A location that felt reliable, one season could fail during another. Heavy rain changes the land, animal movement shifts, wind direction changes with weather. Early humans likely remained cautious enough to notice when familiar places no longer behaved as expected. In this way, safe rest depended on both memory and adjustment. Remember what worked, but remain aware of change. A trusted place still required attention. This balance between trust and caution may have shaped something larger than sleep. It encouraged observation, patience, and shared knowledge within groups. A younger person could quietly learn which places older members returned to, why some areas seemed favored while others remained avoided. Knowledge about safety may have spread through repeated actions more often than spoken instruction. Sleep, though private and vulnerable, may have quietly connected generations through shared habits of survival. Somewhere along this long process, humans may have discovered an important truth about rest. Feeling safe rarely comes from certainty. It often comes from enough familiar signs appearing together at the same time. Dry ground, predictable sound, shelter from wind, fewer signs of disturbance. The night still remained uncertain, but uncertainty felt smaller. And perhaps once humans began learning that familiar places could make the darkness easier to trust, another realization slowly followed. Safety did not always come from the land alone. Sometimes it came from the people sleeping nearby. A safer place to sleep may not always have been a place at all. Sometimes safety may have come from the people nearby. Long before walls, locks, or permanent shelters existed, early humans likely faced an uncomfortable truth. No matter how carefully someone chose a resting place, sleep still required becoming vulnerable. Eyes close, awareness softens, reaction slows. Even the best location could never remove every uncertainty from the night. Yet something important changes when people rest together. One sleeping person is vulnerable. A group, even a small one, becomes something different. Safety may begin to grow not from certainty, but from shared presence. Humans are social creatures, and many researchers believe cooperation played an important role in survival throughout human history. Though evidence cannot fully reconstruct how prehistoric nights unfolded, living in groups likely provided practical advantages difficult to ignore: more ears listening, more eyes noticing movement before sleep, more chances that someone wakes to unfamiliar sound or shifting weather. No formal guard system would be necessary for group living to matter. Humans naturally sleep differently around others. Even today, people often wake briefly through the night without remembering it. In a group, one person stirring may quietly increase awareness for everyone nearby. Warmth may have been another powerful advantage. In colder conditions, sharing body heat matters. Anthropologists observing hunter-gatherer groups and studies of human biology both suggest warmth strongly influences sleep quality and survival. A cold night becomes more manageable when people sleep near one another. This does not mean prehistoric evenings always looked peaceful or orderly, but closeness itself likely reduced strain on the body. A group resting together could create a more stable sleeping environment than someone resting alone against the uncertainty of open land. Children, older adults, or injured members of a group may have depended especially on shared protection. A person unable to react quickly to danger faces greater risks alone. Sleeping together may have quietly extended care across generations, long before humans created formal ideas about community responsibility. A safer sleeping arrangement may not only have helped individuals survive, it may also have protected knowledge, experience, and relationships that strengthened the group over time. Survival becomes different when people depend on one another. Sound likely changed meaning in group settings too: a quiet cough, someone shifting position, familiar breathing patterns nearby. These ordinary details may have brought reassurance rather than disturbance. Humans often relax more easily when surroundings feel familiar, and familiar people are part of that environment. Darkness becomes slightly less uncertain when others are nearby, even if everyone remains vulnerable together. Perhaps one of the quietest forms of prehistoric safety was simply not facing the night alone. Group rest may also have shaped where people chose to stop. A space large enough for several individuals matters differently than a small, protected corner useful only for one person. A sheltered place with room for shared rest, visibility, and movement may gradually become more valuable. The search for safe sleep was no longer only about geography. It increasingly involved relationships between people and place. A location worked not only because it blocked wind or stayed dry, but because it allowed the group to remain together through the night. Of course, living closely with others carried challenges as well. Crowded spaces reduce personal comfort, noise increases, illness can spread more easily. Yet for early humans, the practical benefits of sleeping together may often have outweighed these difficulties. Perfect safety still did not exist, but shared vulnerability became easier to manage than isolation. Somewhere in the long history of restless nights and uncertain landscapes, humans may have begun learning something surprisingly enduring. Sometimes the safest shelter was not stone, trees, or high ground, but the quiet presence of others sleeping close by. Sleeping together may have changed more than comfort. It may have quietly reshaped how early humans organized the night itself. Once rest became something shared rather than solitary, the question was no longer only where to sleep, but how to arrange people within that place. A sheltered area that worked for one individual might feel very different when several people needed space to rest together. Visibility matters differently. Warmth changes. Movement becomes more complicated. Somewhere, over many generations, humans may have begun learning that the structure of a resting place could matter almost as much as the location itself. Archaeologists cannot directly observe how prehistoric groups positioned themselves while sleeping, yet clues from human behavior, anthropology, and practical reasoning suggest that sleeping arrangements likely followed certain patterns. In many social animals today, group rest reduces vulnerability through positioning alone. Individuals often cluster together, with some remaining closer to edges, while others stay more protected near the center. Humans may have developed similar habits naturally, not through rules, but through repeated experience. Children or vulnerable members might sleep nearer the middle. Adults better able to respond quickly may remain closer to openings or exposed areas. These patterns need not be formal to become familiar. Habit often grows quietly from practicality. Space itself likely shaped decisions. A narrow rock shelter with only one entrance creates different possibilities than open ground near scattered trees. In tighter spaces, people sleeping near openings may hear changes outside sooner. On open land, the group may spread differently to maintain visibility while still remaining close enough for warmth and reassurance. The arrangement of bodies, belongings, and later perhaps fire may have slowly transformed ordinary places into spaces that felt more manageable after dark. The land still mattered, but human presence began shaping safety in new ways. Distance between people likely mattered as well. Too far apart, and warning becomes difficult. Too close, and rest becomes uncomfortable. Humans have always balanced personal space with social connection, though conditions likely looked very different in prehistoric life. On colder nights, closeness may become necessary. During warmer seasons, people might spread slightly farther apart while remaining within hearing distance. These decisions may have shifted naturally according to weather, group size, and the shape of available shelter. Flexibility again becomes part of survival. Awareness may also have changed inside a group setting. Sleeping humans do not become completely disconnected from their surroundings. Research today suggests people remain sensitive to unfamiliar disturbances during sleep, particularly sounds or movement that seem unusual. For early humans resting in groups, small interruptions may have quietly spread awareness. One person shifting suddenly, someone waking briefly after hearing movement, a child becoming restless during changing weather. These moments may have created a subtle kind of shared alertness without anyone fully staying awake all night. Safety did not require constant guarding. Sometimes, it may have emerged from many small moments of attention distributed across several people. Even simple routines may have formed over time. certain places for tools, preferred sleeping positions relative to wind or shelter, familiar ways of settling before darkness fully arrived. Humans often repeat behaviors that lower uncertainty, and nighttime uncertainty may have encouraged patterns long before written tradition or structured rules existed. Repetition itself creates comfort. Familiar arrangements reduce confusion when visibility disappears and the world becomes harder to read. Perhaps most importantly, sleeping together may have changed how humans understood danger. Alone, uncertainty feels larger. In a group, risk becomes shared. The night still held unknowns, yet unknowns become easier to face when several people experience them together. A strange sound outside the resting place may still disturb sleep, but it feels different when familiar breathing surrounds you. And perhaps over time, humans began realizing something subtle but deeply important. Choosing a safe place mattered, but learning how to inhabit that place together may have mattered just as much. For early humans, sleeping beside others may have offered something difficult to measure but deeply important. The feeling that the night was slightly less uncertain. Safety is not only physical, it is also emotional, even in its earliest and simplest forms. A place may protect against wind and rain, yet still feel unsettling when faced alone. Darkness changes perception. Familiar shapes disappear. Small sounds seem larger. The imagination fills spaces the eyes cannot see. Long before language fully explained fear, humans may already have understood something quietly practical. Difficult nights often feel easier when someone else is nearby. Researchers today know that humans are strongly social creatures, and social connection influences stress, comfort, and even sleep quality. While prehistoric life looked very different from modern existence, some of these tendencies likely reached deep into human history. Sleeping close to trusted people may have reduced feelings of uncertainty, particularly in unfamiliar environments. The body often rests more easily when surroundings feel predictable, and familiar people are part of that predictability. Familiar voices before sleep, familiar movement nearby, familiar breathing continuing steadily through the night. These small details may have quietly signaled that, for now, things remained stable. Darkness itself may have felt different in company. Alone, every unfamiliar sound demands attention. A rustle in nearby vegetation, changing wind, distant movement, each interruption feels personal when no one else shares responsibility for noticing it. In a group, awareness becomes distributed. One person hearing something unusual may shift position. Another briefly wakes. Someone else listens for a moment before settling again. No formal plan is necessary. Human groups may naturally create shared vigilance simply through presence. The burden of uncertainty becomes lighter when several people carry it together. Trust likely played an important role here. Not every nearby person automatically creates comfort. Familiarity matters. Early humans living in small groups probably spent enormous amounts of time together, traveling, gathering food, observing weather, and facing hardships side by side. Sleep, perhaps the most vulnerable moment of the day, may have strengthened bonds of trust even further. Choosing to rest near others means accepting vulnerability in their presence. Over long periods of time, this quiet act may have reinforced cooperation itself. The group becomes not only a source of practical help, but part of what allows rest to happen at all. Children growing up in such environments may have learned safety through closeness before understanding it through words. Sleeping near caregivers, surrounded by familiar sounds, perhaps taught early lessons about trust in ways too ordinary to notice. Older individuals may rest more comfortably among familiar companions. Injured or exhausted people likely benefited from the quiet reassurance that help remained close if needed. Community, in its earliest forms, may have grown partly from repeated nights spent surviving together. Even today, many people instinctively sleep better in spaces that feel socially familiar. Homes feel different from unfamiliar rooms. A familiar presence nearby often changes how quickly the body relaxes. Scientists remain cautious about drawing direct lines between prehistoric life and modern habits, yet it seems reasonable to wonder whether some of our comfort around trusted people carries echoes of very old experiences. Perhaps part of feeling safe has always involved more than walls or shelter. Perhaps it also involves recognition, the quiet understanding that others remain near while the mind drifts into sleep. Yet group rest alone could never solve every challenge of the night. Cold still arrived, darkness remained, uncertainty lingered beyond the edge of awareness, and somewhere along the long human search for safer rest, another powerful change began altering what night itself could feel like. Humans learned to bring a small piece of daylight into the darkness. For much of human history, night may have felt like something to endure rather than inhabit. Darkness reduced visibility, lowered temperatures, and made even familiar places feel uncertain. A carefully chosen resting place could reduce some risks, and sleeping near trusted people may have softened others, but uncertainty never disappeared completely. Then, at some point in the long story of human survival, something began to change. Humans learned not only to observe fire in the natural world, but eventually to control it. The timing and details remain debated among researchers, and evidence differs across regions and periods. What seems increasingly likely, however, is that controlled fire gradually reshaped how humans experience the night, not suddenly and not perfectly, but meaningfully. It is tempting to imagine fire as an instant solution to prehistoric danger, a glowing barrier that pushed fear into the darkness. Yet reality was probably more modest. Fire did not remove uncertainty. It introduced advantages, while also creating new responsibilities. A flame can warm, illuminate, and perhaps discourage certain animals from coming too close, but it also requires fuel, attention, and careful placement. Smoke gathers in enclosed areas. Sparks create hazards. A fire left unmanaged can disappear before morning or become dangerous itself. For early humans, fire likely became one more tool to improve the odds of a safer night, rather than guarantee one. Warmth may have been among the most immediate changes. Cold has shaped human sleep throughout history in ways easy to underestimate today. Even mild nighttime drops in temperature can affect rest, especially without insulated clothing or permanent shelter. A small fire changes this balance. Suddenly, certain resting places become more usable than before. Slightly exposed ground that once felt too cold might become manageable. A familiar shelter may feel more comfortable through colder hours. Sleep itself may improve when the body spends less energy trying to stay warm. Better sleep often means clearer thinking and stronger movement the following day. Small improvements repeated across generations can quietly matter. Light may have altered nighttime experience just as deeply. Before controlled fire, darkness likely arrived quickly and completely in many environments. Moonlight and stars help, but visibility remains limited. Fire changes the edges of perception. Faces remain visible longer. Familiar surroundings stay recognizable after sunset. Small movements nearby become easier to notice. This does not mean humans suddenly felt secure, but uncertainty may have softened slightly within the circle of light. The night no longer fully erased the world. Perhaps most importantly, fire may have changed how people used resting spaces. Certain shelters that once felt too cold or uncomfortable could become more practical. Outdoor resting areas may remain usable for longer periods. Group sleeping arrangements may slowly shift around warmth and visibility. The shape of nighttime itself begins to change when people gather near a shared source of heat and light, yet fire still carried limits. Archaeological evidence suggests human relationships with fire developed gradually, unevenly, and differently across places. Maintaining fire required knowledge and effort. Wet weather complicates fuel gathering. Strong wind changes behavior. Some shelters trap smoke too heavily to remain comfortable. Humans likely spent long periods learning not only how to use fire, but where and when it worked best. Once again, survival depended on adaptation rather than perfection. Perhaps what made fire important was not that it removed fear, but that it gave humans slightly more influence over the night. A little warmth, a little visibility, a little more time before darkness fully took hold. And somewhere, beside those early flames, people may have started wondering whether rest itself could become something more manageable than it had once been. Once humans learned to control fire, the night may have started feeling slightly less distant. Darkness still surrounded everything beyond the edge of vision, yet now there was a center to gather around. A shared point of warmth and light. The importance of this change may not only have been practical, it may also have been emotional. For perhaps the first time in human history, people could shape a small part of the nighttime environment rather than simply endure it. The darkness remained, but the experience of facing it slowly began to change. Fire may have influenced how animals behaved nearby, though researchers remain careful about making broad claims. Some animals naturally avoid flames, smoke, or unfamiliar movement. Others may simply keep their distance from bright activity or human presence. Yet prehistoric life was complicated, and no campfire guaranteed protection. Animals respond differently depending on species, hunger, weather, and familiarity with people. Fire likely reduced some risks rather than removing them. A flickering flame may discourage approach in certain situations, but humans still needed awareness, good shelter, and practical judgment. Safety continued to come from many small advantages working together. Even so, the psychological effect of fire may have mattered deeply. A familiar space lit by fire feels different from complete darkness. Movement becomes visible, faces remain recognizable. Tools, food, and sleeping areas can still be seen after sunset. The unknown does not disappear, but it moves farther away, beyond the circle of light. Perhaps for early humans, this small zone of visibility offered something surprisingly powerful: temporary predictability. The body often relaxes more easily when surroundings become easier to understand. Night may have remained uncertain, yet less completely unknowable than before. Group life likely changed around fire as well. A sleeping place without fire depends heavily on daylight. Darkness arrives, and activity slows quickly. Fire stretches the evening. People can remain awake longer, finish tasks, stay warmer, or simply remain together before rest begins. Archaeologists and anthropologists have sometimes suggested that shared time around fire may have strengthened communication, memory, and social bonds, though exact details remain difficult to prove. What seems likely is that fire changed how people used time after sunset. Night became something slightly more inhabitable. The arrangement of sleeping space may also have shifted. Warmth naturally draws people closer, creating new patterns in how groups settle for the night. A fire placed poorly may create too much smoke, too much exposure, or unnecessary risk. A fire placed carefully can warm resting areas without overwhelming them. Over time, humans likely learned practical details about distance, airflow, and fuel, which wood burns longer, which places trap smoke, how much warmth remains before dawn. Once again, safe rest depended not on one discovery, but on learning through repetition. Yet fire also introduced responsibility. Someone may need to feed flames through colder nights. Fuel must be gathered before darkness arrives. Rain changes everything. Wind shifts sparks unpredictably. A fire that burns too brightly wastes resources. One that fades too early leaves the cold waiting nearby. Managing fire may have quietly added structure to the evening, encouraging preparation before sleep rather than simple exhaustion at the end of the day. Perhaps this gradual partnership with fire changed more than comfort. It may have changed expectation itself. Instead of hoping the night passed gently, humans could sometimes improve the chances. A warmer resting place, a clearer view nearby, familiar light surrounding familiar people. The night still held uncertainty, but uncertainty no longer felt entirely untouchable. And somewhere in those long evenings beside glowing embers, another lesson slowly emerged. Even warmth and light could not solve everything, because nature still carried one force humans could never fully control: the weather. Fire may have changed the night, but it did not conquer it. A glowing flame can feel powerful when darkness surrounds it, yet for early humans, fire was never a complete answer to the problem of safe rest. Warmth fades, weather shifts, fuel runs out, wind changes direction. Even after learning to control fire, humans still had to choose where to sleep carefully, because nature continued shaping the night in ways no flame could fully control. Perhaps one of the quiet truths of prehistoric life is that survival rarely depended on a single invention. It depended on combining many small advantages at once. A fire placed in the wrong location could solve one problem while creating another. Warmth means little if cold air settles heavily in low ground all night. A sheltered space becomes uncomfortable if smoke gathers too thickly. A windy hillside may keep moisture away but force flames to burn unevenly or disappear too quickly. Even the shape of surrounding stone matters. Some rock shelters trap warmth surprisingly well. Others turn smoke into a constant irritation. Humans likely learned these differences gradually through repeated evenings shaped by discomfort, experimentation, and patience. Rain created another difficult challenge. Wet conditions change almost everything about rest. Fuel becomes harder to gather and harder to keep burning. Ground grows colder. Clothing, or coverings, where they existed, remain damp longer. A fire can warm people only so much when moisture continues drawing heat from the body. During prolonged poor weather, the search for shelter may once again become more important than the fire itself. A dry overhang, better drainage, protection from changing wind. The old lessons of reading the land never disappeared. Fire added possibilities, but it did not replace environmental knowledge. Cold remained equally stubborn. Even today, temperature shapes sleep more than many people realize. During harsh seasons, a fire may warm only part of a resting area, especially through long nights. Someone too far from warmth wakes colder. Fuel must last until dawn. A sudden change in weather can turn familiar places uncomfortable very quickly. Early humans likely understood something deeply practical. Surviving cold nights depended not only on having fire, but on combining fire with shelter, shared warmth, and wise location choices. One solution alone was rarely enough. Wind brought its own frustrations. A strong breeze cools the body quickly and changes how fire behaves. Too much wind scatters sparks or weakens heat. Too little airflow allows smoke to linger painfully. A place ideal for resting without fire may suddenly become difficult once flames are involved. The relationship between shelter and fire likely required adjustment over time. Where should people sit? How close should sleeping areas remain? Which direction offered protection while still allowing smoke to escape? These practical questions may have quietly shaped countless evenings long before written memory existed. Perhaps most importantly, fire could never remove uncertainty entirely. Flames go out. Weather surprises people. Animals still move through darkness. A familiar resting place can suddenly become difficult after changing conditions. Humans likely remained cautious even beside trusted fires, understanding that rest required attention before it could bring comfort. The night became more manageable, but never fully controlled. This may explain why adaptation mattered so deeply in early human survival. Rather than depending completely on one method, people learned to layer advantages together: a good resting place, trusted companions nearby, shelter from wind, dry ground, careful use of fire. Each improvement alone seems small, but together they increase the chances that morning arrives gently rather than harshly. And perhaps after generations spent learning these lessons, humans slowly recognize something impossible to ignore. Even fire had limits, because no force shaped the success of a resting place more consistently than the changing moods of weather itself. A resting place that feels safe one month may feel impossible the next. For early humans, weather likely changed the meaning of nearly every landscape. A dry shelter in warm seasons could become painfully cold when temperatures dropped. A comfortable hollow protected from wind might slowly gather dampness after rain. A place near water that feels practical during one part of the year may become uncomfortable or risky during another. Safety, in prehistoric life, was rarely fixed. It moved with the seasons, changed with temperature, and sometimes disappeared without warning. Perhaps this is why humans became such careful observers of the environment. The land itself could not be understood without also understanding the weather that shaped it. Temperature may have been one of the most powerful influences on where people chose to rest. In warmer climates or seasons, airflow matters. A slight breeze can make sleep easier and reduce discomfort. Yet, during colder periods, the same breeze becomes exhausting, slowly taking warmth from the body throughout the night. A place that feels fresh in summer may feel unbearable in winter. Early humans likely learned not to trust any location too completely. Instead, they may have begun asking quieter questions. How does this place behave when nights become colder? Does moisture settle here after sunset? Does wind strengthen after dark? A familiar resting place could remain familiar while still demanding new decisions as weather shifted. Rain may have changed everything even more dramatically. Dry ground matters enormously when sleep depends on body warmth and limited shelter. A storm does not only bring discomfort, wet conditions affect movement, warmth, visibility, and energy. Ground softens. Fires become harder to maintain. Shelter that seemed reliable may suddenly leak or flood. Even today, people outdoors quickly notice how different familiar places feel after weather changes. For early humans, repeated exposure likely turned rain into one of the most important reasons to rethink where and how to rest. Some places may have gained trust precisely because they remained dry more often than others. Wind likely created subtler challenges. A location protected from strong weather may become desirable during cold nights, yet too much shelter can trap moisture or reduce airflow in warmer conditions. Valleys collect cool air. Open ridges invite exposure. Forest cover softens weather differently than open plains. Each environment quietly changed the rules. There was rarely one perfect answer, only better choices depending on what the sky and season allowed. Humans may have survived partly because they learned flexibility rather than certainty. Seasonal change likely mattered deeply as well. Archaeological evidence suggests many prehistoric groups moved regularly through landscapes rather than staying permanently in one location. Resources shift across the year, and weather changes what places remain practical for rest. A sheltered area, useful during cold months, may feel uncomfortable in heat. A riverside stopping place may work during dry seasons, but become unpredictable after heavy rain. Knowledge about safe rest may have included knowing when not to return to a familiar place. Familiarity mattered, but stubbornness could become costly. This constant negotiation with weather may have quietly strengthened observation itself. People likely learned to notice signs long before conditions fully changed. The feeling of air before rain, the movement of clouds, the direction of wind, the smell of moisture arriving. No forecast existed except the land and sky themselves. Safety depended on paying attention before discomfort became danger. Somewhere across thousands of evenings shaped by changing weather, humans may have begun understanding something deeply practical. A safe resting place was never simply found. It had to be continuously re-evaluated. The world changed too often for certainty to last very long. And perhaps that is why rest, even in familiar places, always required one quiet habit above all else: staying alert to change. For early humans, surviving the night may have depended partly on learning when to stop treating familiar places as permanent answers. A resting spot that worked beautifully during one season could become deeply uncomfortable or even risky when weather changed. This may explain why flexibility appears again and again throughout human history. Rather than remaining attached to one perfect shelter, people likely learned to adapt their choices as the environment shifted around them. Safety was rarely about finding one ideal place. It was about recognizing when yesterday's solution no longer fit today's conditions. Seasonal movement likely shaped many decisions about rest. Archaeological evidence suggests numerous prehistoric groups moved across landscapes in response to changing resources, temperatures, and weather patterns. In colder seasons, people may have preferred locations with stronger protection from wind, better sunlight, or easier access to reliable shelter. During warmer periods, those same locations might feel uncomfortable, damp, or overly enclosed. A valley that traps warmth during cool weather could become unpleasantly still in heat. Open ground useful during dry months may turn exposed when colder winds arrive. The environment constantly reshaped what safe actually meant. Cold weather likely encouraged different priorities than warm weather. When temperatures fall, conserving body heat matters deeply. A place protected from wind becomes more valuable. Shared sleeping arrangements may tighten as people rest closer together. Fire, when available, grows more important, though never sufficient by itself. Slight differences in shelter begin to matter more than they would during comfortable conditions. A rocky overhang that seems unremarkable in mild weather might suddenly feel essential during colder nights. Small environmental advantages become easier to notice when discomfort increases. Warmer seasons may have changed priorities in quieter ways. Airflow becomes useful again. Dense shelters trapping heat and smoke may feel unpleasant. Places near water grow more attractive, though they may also bring insects or moisture. Visibility can matter differently depending on changing vegetation. Thick seasonal growth may block familiar views or reshape movement patterns nearby. A trusted resting place still requires re-evaluation because the landscape itself never stays entirely the same. Rainy periods perhaps demanded the greatest flexibility. Dry ground becomes precious when everything else grows wet. Areas that remained comfortable during ordinary weather may suddenly flood or collect standing moisture. Humans likely learned which slopes drained quickly, which rock shelters leaked, and which places became muddy after repeated storms. Over time, repeated exposure may have created something like a mental map of seasonal reliability. Not permanent certainty, but useful memory. This place works after heavy rain. That place feels warmer during colder nights. Another becomes difficult once wind changes direction. Flexibility may have become one of humanity's quiet strengths, precisely because weather refused to stay predictable. Some animals adapt mainly through physical specialization. Humans seem to have relied heavily on behavioral adjustment. Instead of growing thicker fur or stronger claws, people learned to observe, compare, and change habits. A resting place became less about ownership and more about timing. The right place at the wrong season may fail completely. The imperfect place at the right moment may work surprisingly well. Knowledge itself slowly becomes shelter. This ongoing adjustment likely required patience and shared memory within groups. Older individuals may remember where dry shelter remained during difficult weather. Younger members learn through repetition. Familiar paths between trusted places gradually form. Safety becomes not just a location, but an understanding of when locations change. Somewhere inside these endless seasonal decisions, humans may have discovered something quietly humbling. The environment never stopped asking for adaptation. Even trusted places had to be questioned. And perhaps after enough changing seasons, people began noticing another pattern hidden beneath all this uncertainty. Some dangers announced themselves slowly, while others arrived suddenly in the middle of the night. Even the most carefully chosen resting place could change without warning. A dry patch of ground may feel dependable before sunset, only to turn cold and damp by midnight. Wind shifts direction. Rain arrives unexpectedly. Temperatures fall faster than expected after clear skies. For early humans, danger did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly, transforming an ordinary night into an uncomfortable or difficult one. This may be why survival depended not only on choosing good resting places, but also on remaining ready to adapt when conditions suddenly changed. Weather can shift quickly, especially in exposed environments. A hillside protected from afternoon wind may feel very different after darkness settles. Valleys that seem calm before sunset sometimes collect colder air overnight. A small rise in moisture may slowly soak the ground beneath sleeping bodies. Humans likely learned these lessons through repeated experience rather than perfect prediction. No one could fully control the night, but people may have become skilled at recognizing when a place no longer worked as expected. A resting place did not need to become dangerous to become unusable. Sometimes discomfort alone forces change. A cold wind repeatedly waking people, dampness making rest difficult, smoke blowing unexpectedly into shelter after the weather shifts. Fatigue matters. Poor sleep weakens attention the following day, making hunting, gathering, movement, and decision-making harder. Early humans likely understood this, practically, even without explaining it in abstract terms. A place that interrupted rest too often may gradually lose value, no matter how good it looked during daylight. Sudden rain may have been especially disruptive. Fire weakens or disappears. Ground softens quickly. Shelters that seem dry begin leaking or collecting runoff. People may need to move belongings, shift sleeping positions, or abandon places entirely before morning. This possibility alone may explain why flexibility remained so important. A resting place was never a promise. It was simply the best decision available based on what people knew at the time. Staying too attached to one choice could become risky when conditions changed unexpectedly. Wind likely created quieter but equally frustrating problems. A fire carefully placed before sunset may suddenly send smoke into sleeping areas after a shift in airflow. Warmth disappears faster. Familiar sounds become harder to interpret. Branches move differently overhead. In colder weather, even small changes in exposure can reshape comfort through the night. Humans likely learned to notice these patterns slowly, adjusting where they slept, how closely they gathered, or how shelter was arranged when conditions demanded it. Adaptation itself may have become one of the most valuable survival skills. Group living likely helped during uncertain nights. Someone waking to rain or changing weather may quietly alert others. Shared effort makes sudden adjustments easier. A fire can be rebuilt. Sleeping positions shift. Belongings move toward drier ground. Even emotional comfort matters here. Difficulty often feels smaller when faced together. Once again, safety may have depended not on eliminating uncertainty, but on responding to it well enough. Perhaps this is one reason humans became such persistent observers of the environment. The sky mattered. The shape of clouds mattered. Wind direction mattered. Smells in the air mattered. Survival rewarded those who noticed change before it fully arrived. Yet even careful attention could not prevent every difficult night. Some uncertainty always remained. And perhaps after generations spent learning how weather reshaped every resting place, humans slowly began discovering something equally important. Safety did not come only from reacting to change. It also came from preparing for it before darkness arrived. For early humans, a safer night may have begun long before anyone actually tried to sleep. Rest was not simply something that happened after the day ended. It likely required preparation. Darkness changes how people move, what they can see, and how quickly problems become difficult to solve. A poor decision made before sunset might feel manageable during daylight, only to become frustrating or dangerous once visibility faded. Perhaps this is why preparing for the night slowly became part of survival itself. A peaceful evening often depends on choices made earlier than people realize. Timing may have mattered more than we first imagine. Waiting until darkness fully arrived to search for shelter would likely create unnecessary problems. Visibility drops quickly outdoors. Uneven ground becomes harder to notice. Signs of recent animal movement become less obvious. Weather feels more difficult to predict. Early humans may have learned that choosing where to stop before sunset increased the chances of making calmer decisions. A place inspected in daylight simply reveals more information than one chosen hurriedly at the edge of darkness. In this way, preparation may have quietly reduced uncertainty before the night even began. Observation likely played an important role during these hours. People arriving at a possible resting place may have looked for signs difficult to notice later. Is the ground dry enough? Does wind feel manageable here? Are there signs of repeated animal movement nearby? Does the land slope in ways that might gather water if weather changes? None of these questions needed formal words. Experience alone may have taught people what details mattered. Over time, choosing a resting place likely became less about luck and more about recognizing familiar patterns before problems arrived. Gathering materials may also have become part of evening routine. In environments where fire played a role, fuel needed collecting before darkness made movement harder. Dry branches, suitable wood, or plant material may have been gathered while light remained. A fire helps little if no fuel remains by midnight. Even without fire, simple, practical preparation likely mattered. A place to sit, ground cleared of sharp stones or debris, belongings positioned where they remain easy to reach. Humans often repeat behaviors that reduce uncertainty, and nighttime uncertainty may have encouraged small routines long before formal traditions existed. Group living likely made preparation more organized, even without strict planning. Some people may observe weather, others gather materials. Someone notices a better place slightly farther uphill. Another points out signs of moisture or unstable ground. Cooperation does not always require spoken instruction. Shared experience often shapes quiet habits naturally over time. A group repeatedly surviving together may gradually become better at preparing for difficult nights without needing to discuss every detail. Even emotional preparation may have mattered in subtle ways. Familiar routines calm the mind, sitting near trusted people before darkness settles, finishing simple tasks while light remains. Watching familiar patterns return as evening arrives. These ordinary actions may have reduced uncertainty in ways difficult to measure, but important for rest. The body often settles more easily when things feel predictable. A prepared resting place may not guarantee sleep, but it may allow the night to feel slightly less demanding. Perhaps one of the most overlooked parts of early human survival is how much attention likely happened before sleep itself. Safe rest did not begin when people closed their eyes. It began earlier, while there was still enough light to notice small details others might miss. And somewhere, during those quiet preparations before darkness fully arrived, humans may have slowly learned something practical. Reacting to problems matters, but avoiding them before they begin matters even more. As evening slowly approached, preparation may have shifted from choosing a place to shaping it. A resting area found before sunset still required small adjustments before the group settled for the night. Safe sleep likely depended not only on location, but on how people arranged themselves within it. Darkness changes everything. Paths become harder to see, familiar landmarks disappear into shadow. Even a well-chosen shelter feels different once the sky darkens. Perhaps this is why many small actions before sleep quietly mattered more than they first appear. Ground itself may have received attention. A sleeping place scattered with sharp stones, loose branches, or damp patches quickly becomes uncomfortable. Early humans likely understood this through repeated experience. Clearing small obstacles may not sound important, yet poor sleep weakens attention and energy the following day. A place that feels manageable at sunset can feel exhausting after hours of discomfort. Even slight improvements, a drier patch of ground, smoother surface, better protection from wind, may have quietly improved rest more than dramatic solutions ever could. Positioning within the group likely mattered too. Anthropologists studying social living often note that humans naturally arrange themselves in ways shaped by comfort, trust, and practical need. Though prehistoric sleeping patterns remain difficult to reconstruct directly, it seems reasonable that familiarity influenced who rested near whom. Children may stay closer to caregivers. Older individuals or injured members may rest where support feels easier to reach. People more aware of changing conditions may remain nearer openings or edges of shelter. No formal system would necessarily be required. Repeated nights naturally create habits. Habits become expectations. Expectations quietly reduce uncertainty. The environment itself may still receive one final round of attention before darkness fully settled. Does the wind feel stronger now than earlier? Is moisture beginning to gather? Are familiar sounds continuing normally? Someone may notice clouds changing shape overhead. Another sees movement near vegetation and quietly decides a different sleeping position feels wiser. Preparation likely remained flexible rather than fixed. Conditions change, and people change with them. This habit of small adjustment may have mattered as much as any single choice made earlier in the day. Fire, where available, may have encouraged additional routines. Fuel placed nearby for easier access during the night. Sleeping areas adjusted to avoid too much smoke while remaining close enough for warmth. Someone perhaps notices wind shifting and repositions closer to shelter. A fire itself requires attention before rest begins. Too little preparation means cold before dawn. Too much fuel wastes effort. Even small decisions may quietly shape whether the night feels manageable or frustrating. Humans likely became skilled at noticing details because details mattered repeatedly. Familiar behavior may also have carried emotional value. Repetition calms uncertainty, sitting in known places, following familiar evening rhythms, settling near trusted people, watching light slowly fade while ordinary sounds continue around the group. The body often relaxes more easily when patterns repeat. For early humans, who faced much greater unpredictability than most people experience today, these routines may have softened some of the unease that naturally arrives with darkness. The night remained uncertain, but preparation made uncertainty feel smaller. Perhaps one of the quiet achievements of early human life was this growing ability to shape vulnerability into something more manageable. Not through perfect control, because nature never allowed that, but through preparation repeated carefully enough to improve the odds. Sleep still required trust, yet trust no longer depended entirely on luck. It increasingly depended on habits learned through observation, memory, and patience. And somewhere, after countless evenings shaped by these small routines, humans may have begun understanding that safety often begins long before danger appears. Over time, early humans may have begun discovering something quietly powerful. Uncertainty could not be removed, but it could sometimes be reduced. The night would always carry unknowns, weather changes, strange sounds, sudden cold, unexpected movement beyond the edge of visibility. Yet preparation slowly transformed these uncertainties from complete surprises into possibilities people could anticipate. A safer night did not come from certainty. It came from becoming slightly better at prediction. And perhaps this small shift changed the human relationship with rest more deeply than we often realize. Imagine how different the night may feel after many repeated experiences. A person who has slept through sudden rain learns to avoid low ground. Someone who has watched wind shift after sunset begins choosing shelter more carefully. A group repeatedly disturbed by poor placement of fire learns to prepare fuel differently or position sleeping areas farther from smoke. No single lesson solves everything, but repeated lessons accumulate. Humans may have become increasingly skilled at asking practical questions before darkness arrived. What could go wrong here? What happened last time? What signs matter tonight? In this way, experience itself slowly became a form of protection. Preparation likely encouraged a growing sense of predictability. Certain habits repeated because they worked reasonably well. Stop before darkness deepens. Check the ground. Notice changing weather. Gather enough fuel. Stay close enough to trusted people. Leave room to adjust if conditions worsen. These routines may sound ordinary, yet ordinary actions repeated over generations can quietly shape survival. Humans rarely thrive by removing uncertainty completely. More often, people succeed by learning how to live alongside it. Even emotional experience may have changed as preparation improved. A prepared resting place likely feels different from one chosen in haste. Familiar routines reduce stress. The body settles differently when surroundings feel understood. Predictability matters deeply to rest, perhaps especially in environments filled with risk. For early humans, the evening may gradually have become less about hoping the night remained kind and more about quietly increasing the odds that it would. The darkness remained the same, but human readiness slowly changed, yet preparation never guaranteed success. Some nights likely still went badly despite careful choices. Rain arrives stronger than expected. Wind suddenly changes direction. A familiar shelter becomes uncomfortable. Fire fails. Strange movement nearby interrupts rest. Perhaps one of the most difficult lessons humans learned is that good preparation reduces problems, but never eliminates them. Safety remains imperfect. The world continues changing whether people feel ready or not. This may explain why flexibility remained so important. A group unable to adapt when plans failed could struggle deeply. Someone notices flooding ground and shifts position. Others move closer together against sudden cold. A fire gets rebuilt after rain weakens it. The best resting places may not have been those where nothing ever went wrong, but those where people could respond when things changed unexpectedly. Adaptation mattered as much as preparation. Perhaps somewhere in these repeated evenings, humans slowly discovered something still familiar today. Feeling safe often comes not from believing nothing bad can happen, but from trusting that problems can be handled if they do. The night still held uncertainty, but uncertainty no longer felt completely overwhelming. And yet, even with preparation, memory, shelter, fire, and trusted companions, there were still evenings when rest failed entirely, when the chosen place simply did not work. And those difficult nights may have taught humans some of their most important lessons of all. Not every carefully chosen resting place worked. Some nights likely unfolded exactly as hoped. Dry ground, manageable weather, familiar sounds fading gently into sleep. But other nights may have reminded early humans that preparation, however thoughtful, could only do so much. A place that felt safe before sunset might slowly reveal problems after darkness arrived. Wind shifts direction. Rain gathers unexpectedly. Cold settles more heavily than expected. Strange sounds interrupt rest. For people living closely with the environment, failure was probably not rare. It was part of learning. And perhaps some of the most important lessons about safe sleep came from nights that did not go well. Imagine arriving at a resting place that seems practical during daylight. The ground feels dry. Nearby shelter softens the wind. The area appears calm. Yet several hours later, temperatures drop sharply. Cold air begins settling into lower ground. Dampness slowly spreads through clothing or bedding materials where such materials existed. Sleep becomes shallow and interrupted. By morning, everyone feels slower, colder, more exhausted. No disaster necessarily occurred, yet the place quietly failed in an important way. A poor night's rest matters more when survival depends on attention and movement the next day. Rain may have turned comfortable evenings difficult with surprising speed. Even light rainfall changes the experience of rest outdoors. Fire weakens, ground softens, familiar sleeping areas grow damp. A shelter that looked reliable begins allowing water through unexpected gaps. Perhaps people shift closer together for warmth. Someone moves belongings to higher ground. Others stay awake longer than planned, adjusting to conditions they hoped would not arrive. The night continues, but not comfortably. Sometimes, survival may have meant enduring poor conditions rather than escaping them. Wind may have caused quieter frustrations. A place protected earlier in the day can suddenly feel exposed after weather changes. Smoke from fire drifts into sleeping areas instead of away. Warmth disappears faster than expected. Sounds become harder to interpret. Branches move differently overhead, making familiar surroundings feel strangely unfamiliar. Humans likely learned over time that conditions at sunset did not always predict what midnight would feel like. A good resting place needed to survive change. Not only comfort, interrupted sleep itself may have become part of prehistoric reality more often than modern people imagine. Research on sleep suggests humans naturally wake briefly through the night, especially in unfamiliar or uncertain environments. For early humans resting outdoors, disturbances likely came regularly. Weather changes, nearby movement, cold, hunger, noise, rest may rarely have looked like uninterrupted sleep for many hours. Instead, the goal may simply have been enough recovery to continue facing tomorrow's demands. A perfect night was probably uncommon. A manageable night may have counted as success. Yet failure likely carried lessons. A flooded hollow teaches caution about low ground. A windy ridge encourages better shelter choices next time. A smoky resting area changes how fire gets placed. Humans may have become skilled not because mistakes disappeared, but because mistakes slowly became information. Memory grows strongest around discomfort. What interrupts sleep often gets remembered more clearly than what passes easily. Perhaps this is one reason human survival became tied so closely to observation. The environment constantly tested decisions. Some nights rewarded preparation, others exposed weaknesses. Yet through repetition, people likely grew better at responding to problems before they became overwhelming. And perhaps after enough difficult nights, humans began learning another quiet truth. Sometimes surviving the night depended less on avoiding mistakes and more on knowing how to recover when plans failed. When a resting place stopped working, early humans likely faced a difficult decision: adapt or endure. Neither option was easy. Darkness limits visibility, cold weakens patience, and exhaustion makes clear thinking harder. A place that feels uncomfortable before sleep may feel far worse after several interrupted hours. Yet abandoning a resting area in complete darkness could create new risks as well. Uneven ground becomes harder to navigate. Weather feels more unpredictable. Familiar landmarks disappear into shadow. Perhaps for this reason, many difficult nights were not solved completely. They were managed as carefully as possible until morning arrived. Small adjustments may have become some of the most valuable survival skills. A sleeping area growing damp might encourage people to move slightly uphill or closer beneath shelter. A shifting wind could force changes in position to reduce cold or avoid smoke. Someone may gather remaining fuel to strengthen a weakening fire before temperatures drop further. None of these actions guarantee comfort, but comfort was likely not always the goal. Sometimes the goal was simply making a difficult night manageable enough to get through. Humans have long survived by improving bad situations, even when perfect solutions remain unavailable. Group living may have mattered even more during uncomfortable nights. A person resting alone faces every problem independently. In groups, responses become shared. People may move closer together when temperatures fall unexpectedly. Someone already awake notices rain beginning and quietly alerts others. A fire weakened by weather becomes easier to rebuild when effort is shared. Even emotional reassurance matters. Difficulty often feels slightly smaller when experienced alongside familiar people. Humans may not always remove hardship, but companionship can soften its weight. Flexibility likely shaped how groups responded. Sometimes staying put may have made the most sense. A shelter still provides protection despite discomfort. Moving too quickly creates new uncertainty. Other nights may have forced change. Water begins gathering under sleeping areas. Smoke becomes impossible to avoid. Wind exposure grows unbearable. Humans probably learned, through repeated experience, when patience mattered, and when adjustment became necessary. Survival often depends on judgment rather than certainty. Even sleep itself may have changed during difficult conditions. A cold or stormy night likely interrupted rest repeatedly. Short periods of sleep mixed with waking moments may have been common. Someone shifts position for warmth. Another briefly wakes after hearing movement outside. A child grows restless as temperatures change. Perfect rest may have been rare in difficult environments, but partial rest still matters. Humans are remarkably adaptable when recovery comes in smaller pieces. Perhaps prehistoric nights often involved compromise more than comfort. Morning may have carried lessons as important as the night itself. People waking tired, damp, or uncomfortable likely remembered what caused trouble: a place too exposed, a shelter poorly suited for rain, not enough fuel collected before sunset. These memories may quietly shape future decisions. One difficult night improves the next. Over generations, repeated failures become practical knowledge shared within groups. Learning grows through discomfort as much as success. Perhaps one of the least obvious strengths of early humans was not avoiding hardship entirely, but remaining flexible when hardship arrived unexpectedly. Plans fail, weather changes, sleep gets interrupted. Yet survival continues because people adjust rather than collapse under uncertainty. And somewhere after enough restless nights shaped by compromise and patience, humans may have started recognizing something surprisingly useful. Even bad nights could teach how to make tomorrow a little easier. Not every difficult night disappears when morning arrives. Some discomfort fades quickly, but certain experiences likely remained in memory long after the sun returned. A resting place flooded by rain, cold settling too deeply into the body, wind keeping everyone awake for hours, strange sounds that never allowed true rest. For early humans, failure may have been frustrating, exhausting, even frightening at times, yet failure also carried information. Perhaps one of humanity's quiet strengths is this ability to remember difficulty and slowly turn it into better decisions. Nights that went badly may have shaped future choices more strongly than peaceful ones. Humans often remember discomfort with unusual clarity. A comfortable evening passes quietly through memory. A miserable night stays longer. Someone wakes repeatedly because smoke drifted into shelter. Another struggles against damp ground that looked harmless before sunset. A group spends hours restless because winds strengthened after dark. These experiences may quietly change behavior without anyone needing to explain why. Next time, people stop slightly farther uphill. Fuel gets gathered earlier, sleeping positions shift. Shelter is reconsidered more carefully. Memory itself slowly becomes protection. Archaeologists and anthropologists often suggest that repeated experience likely shaped survival throughout human history. Early humans did not need perfect understanding of weather patterns or animal behavior to improve decisions. They only needed enough memory to notice what happened repeatedly. This place floods after heavy rain. That rock shelter traps too much smoke. Another hillside remains calmer during strong wind. Knowledge grows through patterns, not certainty. A safer resting place may simply have been the result of many remembered mistakes gradually becoming wisdom. Group living likely helped preserve these lessons as well. Knowledge rarely belongs to one person alone. Older members of a group may remember where difficult weather caused trouble years before. Younger individuals learn through observation, repetition, and shared experience. A child watching adults quietly avoid certain areas may absorb lessons without formal explanation. Over time, habits form. Certain routes get reused, some resting places gain trust, others quietly lose it. Memory becomes collective, shaped by many nights rather than one. Difficult nights may even strengthen preparation itself. A poor experience often encourages greater attention next time. People gather more fuel because previous fires faded too early. Shelter gets inspected more carefully after rain once caused problems. Sleeping positions change because cold gathered unexpectedly before dawn. Humans seem naturally inclined to adjust behavior after discomfort, and prehistoric survival likely depended heavily on this ability. Improvement rarely came from dramatic discoveries. More often, it emerged through countless small corrections repeated over generations. Yet even the best memory could never remove uncertainty completely. Weather still surprises people. Familiar places still fail occasionally. The environment continues changing. Perhaps this is why flexibility mattered just as much as experience. Humans may have learned not to trust success too blindly, nor fear failure too deeply. One bad night teaches caution. One peaceful night builds confidence. Survival rests somewhere between memory and adaptation. Perhaps somewhere inside all these repeated evenings, good nights, difficult nights, interrupted sleep, quiet success, and uncomfortable mistakes, humans slowly built something larger than survival skills alone. They began shaping an understanding of safety itself. Not as perfection, because perfection never existed, but as a careful balance between preparation, attention, trust, and patience. And maybe after thousands of years spent searching for places gentle enough to rest until morning, humans began carrying one quiet lesson forward. Safety is rarely found once and forever. It is something learned, adjusted, and rebuilt again and again. After thousands of nights spent searching for safer places to rest, early humans may have discovered something unexpected. Safety was never a destination finally reached. It remained something temporary, something constantly adjusted. A dry shelter works until weather changes. A familiar resting place feels reliable until conditions shift. Fire warms the night, but eventually fades. Trusted habits help, though uncertainty never disappears completely. Perhaps one of the quietest truths of human history is that people never stopped learning how to rest more safely. They only became better at responding to uncertainty, and in some ways, that process may still continue today. It is easy to imagine prehistoric sleep as something entirely distant from modern experience. Stone shelters instead of houses, fire instead of electricity, open landscapes instead of locked doors. Yet perhaps the emotional experience feels more familiar than we expect. Even now, humans rarely sleep well when surroundings feel uncertain. An unfamiliar hotel room feels different from home. Strange sounds interrupt rest more easily. Unexpected temperature changes feel frustrating. Many people instinctively check doors, adjust blankets, dim lights, or create routines before sleep. These habits may seem modern, yet perhaps they echo something much older: the human desire to reduce uncertainty before becoming vulnerable for the night. Scientists studying sleep sometimes note how sensitive humans remain to unfamiliar environments. Many people sleep more lightly in new places. Background sounds feel different. The mind remains slightly more alert. Researchers continue exploring exactly why this happens, but some wonder whether part of human sleep still carries ancient caution. The night asks for trust, yet trust is rarely immediate. Familiarity matters. Predictability matters. Perhaps the search for safe rest shaped human psychology more deeply than we often notice. The lessons of early humans may not feel dramatic, but they remain quietly practical. Safety rarely depended on strength alone. It came through observation, preparation, flexibility, shared trust. The willingness to adjust when familiar solutions stopped working. A safer resting place was not necessarily the strongest shelter or the highest ground. Often, it was simply the place where many small advantages gathered together: dryness, familiar sounds, shelter from wind, trusted companions, enough warmth to make sleep possible. Small things repeated patiently often shaped survival more than dramatic moments ever did. Perhaps this way of thinking still influences modern life in quiet ways. People create routines before bed. They return to familiar spaces. They feel calmer around trusted people, a favorite blanket, familiar room temperature, soft sounds in the background. These details may seem ordinary, yet ordinary details often matter most when the body prepares for sleep. Comfort rarely comes from one perfect solution. It emerges from many small things working together, just as they may have for early humans facing uncertain nights long ago. Yet one difference separates modern people from those distant ancestors. Many of us rarely notice how extraordinary safe sleep truly is. A dry room, predictable temperature, protection from weather, relative quiet. These conditions often feel ordinary because they are familiar, but for much of human history, peaceful rest may have depended on endless small decisions repeated carefully, night after night. Somewhere inside this long story of searching for safer places to rest, humans may have slowly learned something surprisingly enduring. Rest becomes easier not when uncertainty disappears, but when enough trust grows to sleep despite it. Perhaps one of the most important lessons early humans learned about rest is that survival rarely depended on certainty. It depended on adaptation. The world changed too often for perfect solutions to last very long. Weather shifts. Landscapes transform. Familiar places stop working as expected. Even trusted habits sometimes fail. Yet humans continued sleeping, waking, learning, and adjusting. Safe rest did not come from controlling nature completely. It came from paying attention closely enough to respond when things changed. In many ways, the search for safe places to rest may quietly reveal one of humanity's oldest strengths: the ability to adapt without fully understanding everything. Early humans did not possess weather forecasts, permanent buildings, or detailed scientific explanations. They may not have known exactly why one valley became colder after sunset, or why some shelters stayed drier than others. Yet complete understanding was not required for improvement. Observation mattered, experience mattered. A person notices cold gathering repeatedly in one area and chooses differently next time. A group remembers where storms caused problems and avoids returning during similar conditions. Small corrections repeated over many generations slowly become practical knowledge. Survival often grows from patience more than certainty. This habit of observation may have shaped human thinking far beyond sleep itself. Learning safe places to rest likely encouraged broader attention to patterns in the environment: wind before rain, animal movement near water, seasonal changes across familiar landscapes. The night may have taught humans to notice subtle details because subtle details often mattered. Perhaps many forms of practical intelligence grew quietly from this repeated relationship with uncertainty. Resting safely required people to ask careful questions before answers fully existed. Community likely became another essential lesson. Again and again, safe rest seems to return to shared effort, trusted companions nearby, shared warmth, shared awareness, shared memory of what worked and what failed. Humans are often described as physically vulnerable compared with many animals. We lack claws, speed, thick fur, or natural armor, yet people survived in astonishingly varied environments across the world. Cooperation may explain part of that success. A difficult night becomes easier when several people face it together. A safer resting place often depends not only on geography, but on relationships. Perhaps safety itself became something partly social long before humans ever named it. There may also be a quieter lesson hidden inside all these restless evenings of prehistoric life. Comfort rarely arrives all at once. It grows gradually, one better decision, one remembered mistake, one familiar place revisited, one successful adjustment after difficult weather. Humans often imagine survival as dramatic moments of danger and rescue, yet most of history likely unfolded through ordinary evenings, shaped by patience and repetition. People simply trying to make tomorrow slightly easier than yesterday. In that sense, the search for safe sleep may reflect something deeply human. We continue arranging our environments in ways that reduce uncertainty. Locks on doors, familiar routines before bed, warm blankets, trusted homes, soft lighting, comfortable sounds. Many modern comforts may look different from prehistoric shelters, yet the instinct behind them feels strangely familiar. Humans still seek the same quiet thing, enough safety to rest. Perhaps this long history leaves behind a gentle reminder. Progress often happens through attention rather than perfection. The people who survived difficult nights may not always have been the strongest or luckiest. Sometimes they were simply the ones willing to notice small problems, remember hard lessons, and adjust patiently when the world changed around them. And after thousands of years spent learning how to rest beneath uncertain skies, one final question still lingers quietly in the background. What does it truly mean to feel safe enough to fall asleep? After all these thousands of nights, one quiet truth seems to remain. Early humans probably never found a perfect place to rest. No shelter stayed ideal forever. No fire removed every uncertainty. No familiar location guaranteed an easy night. Rain still arrived. Cold still returned. Strange sounds still interrupted sleep. Yet despite all this, humans rested anyway. Not because danger disappeared, but because people slowly learned how to live beside uncertainty rather than wait for certainty to arrive. Perhaps that is one of the most human stories hidden inside the search for safe sleep. Progress came slowly, carefully, repeatedly. A better place after one uncomfortable night. A wiser decision after bad weather. A remembered mistake passed quietly from one person to another. The search for safer rest was never only about survival, it was also about learning. Every difficult evening may have added something small to human understanding. A little more patience, a little more observation, a little more trust in familiar rhythms. Over time, these quiet improvements likely shaped far more than sleep alone. They shaped resilience. One of the gentlest lessons hidden in this story may be that safety rarely appears all at once. It often grows gradually through attention, through noticing what helps, through remembering what hurts, through adjusting when familiar solutions stop working. Early humans may never have controlled the world around them, yet they slowly became better at responding to it. Perhaps that remains true for people now as well. We still seek places that feel calm before sleep. We still build routines that reduce uncertainty. We still sleep more easily when warmth, familiarity, and trust gather together in the same space. In ways both visible and invisible, the search continues. Yet perhaps this history also offers something worth appreciating. Safe sleep, the kind so ordinary many people barely notice, may be one of humanity's quiet achievements. A dry room, familiar sounds, predictable warmth, a door that closes, a place where the body feels safe enough to rest. For most of human history, these things often required effort, observation, cooperation, and adaptation repeated again and again. What feels ordinary today may carry echoes of countless careful choices made long ago. And perhaps there is one final lesson worth carrying forward. Humans survived uncertain nights not by becoming fearless, but by becoming attentive, paying attention to the environment, to one another, to changing conditions, to small problems before they grow larger. The people who rested most safely were likely not those who found perfect answers, because perfect answers rarely existed. More often, they were simply those willing to observe carefully and adapt patiently. If this long story leaves behind any quiet educational message, perhaps it is this: life rarely becomes completely predictable, but learning to notice, prepare, and care for one another can make uncertainty feel a little smaller. That may be one of the oldest forms of wisdom humans ever learned. And now, as you settle into your own familiar place of rest, perhaps one question still drifts softly through the darkness, unanswered after all these years. When do humans truly begin to feel safe enough to sleep?